minutes.
Okay, well, let me get started then. I thought I would speak today on some of the plants that have done particularly well for us. Now I'm at 1,100 foot elevation, 900 to 1,100 foot elevation at our farm. We're in the foothills of the Cascades. We get about 75 inches of precipitation a year. Often there's snow in the wintertime. So we're a little colder than the Puget Sound region. And but we've been here since 1980. And so I originally started out wanting to grow nut trees and fruit trees for myself. And the farm has evolved quite a bit over the years, over the decades, as I've found some plants easier to grow than others, and quite a bit easier than others. We're certified organic in our fruit and nut production on the farm. And so we've always looked for varieties of plants that are naturally insect and disease resistant, and also that are able to ripen consistently. If they're not able to ripen consistently, then it's not very economical for us to continue growing them. But a lot of the things we still grow because we like them. But what I'd like to talk about today are those things that have really been more successful for us. Now, we grow a lot of types of apples, for example, including the Monty's Surprise apple here, which is a new variety that we're just introducing into North America starting next year, I hope. It's been in quarantine since, well, for about 10 years now. We brought it in from New Zealand as a stick of cyanwood about a dozen years ago. And it's very stringent quarantine rules against bringing in certain plant material from other continents, especially apples, since apples are such a big part of Washington State's agriculture. The Monty Surprise apple, I first found out about it from this book, Eating on the Wild Side, by Joe Robinson, a Vashon Island food writer, who was interested in the lost nutritional quality in our fruits and vegetables. And turns out in her research that the Monty Surprise was the most nutritious apple on earth. And could she supply some for me? Well, I looked into it and found that it wasn't available in North America, only in New Zealand. So I made contact with the New Zealand originators of the variety and was able to get in a stick of cyanwood. So we're propagating that variety and 75 other varieties of apples, a lot of cider apples, early ripening apples, late ripening apples, and all sorts. But apples are not the easiest thing to grow, as you know, with the apple maggot and the codling moth. It makes it more of a challenge. In fact, apple trees are the only crop that we spray, and we use a certified organic spray known as Entrust. The active ingredient is spinosad, which is a naturally occurring fungus that has no toxicity to mammals or birds, just insects that it comes in contact with. It's an expensive spray. You have to use it a number of times in the summer. So I'd like to talk about some fruits that are easier to grow than apples that we don't have to spray. We've enjoyed growing Asian pears for many decades, and we find them easier to grow than apples. For one thing, they're scab resistant. They don't get any diseases that we've ever encountered here, and they taste great. And we have varieties of Asian pears that come on as early as August, and we have varieties that will keep into the summer. Varieties such as the Korean Giant, I have managed to keep some last year into August when the first crop of the new varieties was ripe. So just to say that I can claim that I was eating my own Asian pears 12 months out of the year. They're quick to bear, heavy bearing fruits that are quite well adapted to our climate. And so that's one fruit that we've really enjoyed and grow commercially on a small scale at our farm. Another fruit that's been very successful for us is the elderberry. Now, I started planting elderberries, I think around 81, just as I was first clearing land here, 81 or 82. And I put some North American black elderberries, three of them in a bed, and and I started getting the fruit the following year, and I've had fruit ever since then. So this is a crop that's fruited for over 35 years in a row with no inputs from me whatsoever, other than harvesting the fruit. I didn't water them. Well, after the first summer, I didn't water them, didn't prune them, didn't do anything to them except harvest the fruit. And so one of the wonderful things about elderberries is that they're incredible for their immune boosting properties. And so I've always kept a reserve of elderberry fruits in our freezer in case I feel like I'm coming down with something. I find that just consuming elderberries in one form or another is the most effective way I've found against viruses. And half the time, the early onset of symptoms of colds and such will just go away just by consuming elderberries regularly until the symptoms go away. And so the only issue I have with them is that some of the later harvest is popular with the birds. The first flush of harvest is usually something I can beat the birds to, because there's enough ripe fruits around in August when they first come on. But they'll have they bloom in the summer, and then they have a second bloom a few weeks later, and then a second ripening a few weeks after the first harvest. And that second harvest, we have to watch more closely in September for bird predation. But there's many varieties of elderberries that we're growing now. The European elderberries are very well adapted here. They're from Northern Europe, from places like Germany and Denmark. They have the more fragrant flowers, as opposed to the North American black elderberries, which don't have as fragrant of a flower, but their fruits are just as useful in medicinal properties. I went into a Fred Meyer store once looking at different products that they were carrying that had elderberry in it. And I counted 38 different products that they were selling with elderberry as an active ingredient for health purposes. Now, we do have two species of elderberries native to Western Washington. The red elderberries are not considered edible for human consumption. They're the most common one that you find in the forests around here. They bloom early, they ripen early, bright red fruits, very ornamental, and birds like them, but they're not considered edible for humans. I don't think they're really that toxic unless you ate a bunch of them, but there's not something that humans should be eating, especially in a raw state. The native blue elderberry, Sambucus caerulea, is native to both sides of the Cascades. It's actually more common east of the Cascades, and is found in Western Washington, mostly just in clearings. We found an elderberry, a blue elderberry, here on Burnt Ridge about 35 years ago that was pushing 38 feet in height and width from branch tip to branch tip. I think that was a real record breaker. But so they can, that's the native blue elderberry is the largest of all the elderberries. That's unusually large, but the American elderberries, I'm able to harvest them without resorting to ladder work. So they on their own, they've only gotten about 8 feet tall. So I can reach up and harvest all the fruit off them. And they grow as a multi-stem shrub, so they're throwing up new suckers every year. But some of the European varieties have ornamental qualities as well. This is, I don't know if you can appreciate this or not. This is a variety called Black Lace, which is a European elderberry with the cut leaf foliage and with the black leaves, purplish black leaves. And there's a number of different European cultivars that have black foliage or golden foliage or cut leaf foliage. And the black leafed cultivars also have kind of a pinkish flower. So incidentally, in Europe, the flowers are as highly regarded as a food source as the fruits themselves. So the flowers can be eaten. The white flower clusters, which are about this big, can be eaten as a vegetable in salads. They can be battered and fried. And we found in in Ireland, in England, and in Norway, when we were visiting there a few years ago, that in all three countries, that elderberry flower drinks were very popular. I mean, they were as popular as soda pops and such. So at any rate, so that's a very easy to grow shrub. That's of course, with the berries themselves, they're small BB-sized berries, but in these very large clusters. So you can get, you know, with the just snapping off a cluster, you've got hundreds of berries and in each cluster. And if you freeze them, then they're very easy to swipe off in one sweep as a frozen berry. They can stain. In fact, elderberry juice, I was just talking to a commercial fruit grower today who wanted to put in 20 acres of elderberries. And he has a cherry orchard, and he uses the elderberries in part to color the fruits and color the juice rather darker, and also for its nutritional quality. And of course, elderberry jams, elderberry sauces, elderberry pies. Usually the recommendations, especially with the American types, is that they be cooked first. I didn't realize that for a number of years, and I've been consuming them raw for over 30 years before I read that they should be cooked and with no ill effects. And I know that with the European elderberries, they're considered quite edible raw. But at any rate, so another fruit that I would like to talk a bit on that I found very easy to grow once we identified varieties that were suitable to Western Washington are fig trees. Now figs, you know, I have a book on fig varieties written in the 1950s in California, and it lists over 850 named varieties of figs known at that time in California. And a lot of the fig varieties that we grow aren't even mentioned in that book. So over the years, I've kept my eye open for varieties that would ripen here in the Northwest. And because most of the varieties of figs known in California and throughout the world will not ripen in the Northwest, because we don't have nearly the kind of heat necessary to ripen figs. But the varieties that we grow successfully here are varieties that are pretty consistent ripeners, even at 1,000-foot elevation. So, and I find them really pretty easy to grow. They don't need cross-pollination. At least that is to say, the varieties that we grow are self-pollinating. Not all fig varieties are, but the varieties that we grow are self-pollinating. So you can just have one and you'll get figs. And they ripen in the summer. So they're the varieties that we grow have proven themselves. I would rate as number one are at our location, the Desert King variety. Despite its name, it's very well adapted to Western Washington. And it's actually taking advantage of two growing seasons, because the figs that will ripen for us this summer started to form late last summer and are little tiny bumps on the ends of each branch right now, smaller than the eraser of a pencil right now. But those will develop into figs next summer. So they're taking advantage of two growing seasons. Some varieties of figs are less well adapted to our location here, but are adapted to warmer air elevations or lower elevations in the Puget Sound. For example, the Olympian fig. The original Olympian fig was found in Olympia, not surprisingly, and I've had a little trouble establishing it here at our high elevation site. It doesn't seem to be quite as hardy as varieties like Desert King and some of the others that we grow successfully here. It seems to be, well, and I should point out that the original tree is literally a stone's throw from Puget Sound. So it is in a more protected area. And in Olympia, it can ripen 2 crops a year in a good year, such as a few other varieties that are capable of that also, such as the Madeleine de Deux Saisons, also known as Dan's favorite, I believe, and Italian honey fig is another variety where we'll get an August crop and we'll also often ripen a crop in late September or early October on the new growth. So, very good quality figs as well. So, And there's many other varieties that have been successful here. I should say about 10 varieties that can be grown pretty consistently in Western Washington. And what you need to grow figs is a good sunny location. The warmer, the better. The more ripe figs you'll get. I find now we get a little colder here at this elevation. In 1989, it got to 0 degrees for 3 nights. And that was the coldest that I've ever recorded here in 41 years. And I lost my whole fig orchard. They all froze to the ground at 0 degrees. Now, the following summer, they all sprouted back from the roots. And figs are grown from cuttings. They're not grafted like most fruit trees. And so they resprouted true to name. And since then, I learned to encourage them to be multi-stemmed bushes rather than trees. When they resprouted vigorously from the roots, it made it easier to grow them as a bush. And so now that's how I grow them. I plant our figs real close together, like 7 feet apart, and we encourage them to be throwing up suckers. And that way we can harvest the crop without having to resort to any ladder work. Because figs are a crop that has to be really dead ripe to be any good. I saw some figs in a grocery store a couple of years ago from California, and so out of curiosity, I tried some and I threw them out. They were not suitably ripe as far as I was concerned. Figs are not the sort of fruit that goes through an after ripening process like some fruits do, like pears or kiwi fruits. They have to be dead ripe to be any good. And that means they have to be really soft and squishy, and they're not going to ship well from California when they're like that. So at any rate, it's one of those crops that are much better growing yourself than anything that you could buy in a store, really. The ones that are just falling apart and cracking on the sides and look like they're really overripe are really going to be the best tasting ones. And it's a wonderful sweet fruit, just sugary sweet. Now, another fruit that we really like that's also just incredibly sweet and very well adapted to Western Washington and related to figs is the mulberry. Now, figs and mulberry share a common point in that they're both members of the rubber family, hardy members of the rubber family, but mulberries are quite hardy. In fact, I was recently talking to a fellow in northern Wisconsin who has some of our mulberry trees at 40 below 0 Fahrenheit. So some of them can really quite hardy. But the variety that we're planting the most of nowadays in the mulberry realm is the Pakistan variety, which is one of our least hardy mulberries, but still hardy enough to grow here at 1,000 feet. And the interesting thing about the Pakistan mulberry is that it's the world's largest mulberry, and they can get as long as my index finger. So they're really quite a large mulberry, and they're also kind of firm as mulberries go. They don't squish and stain your hands easily like some black mulberry varieties can. And they're sweet and they taste great, and they keep well for a mulberry, which is saying something because most mulberries won't keep any better than a raspberry. So it's a cool fruit, and these are trees, and the Pakistan mulberry is a very vigorous variety. So, and yet we're planting them 7 feet apart. And when we first plant them, we cut them way back to within a couple feet of the ground to encourage them to shoot up lots of low branches. So we're growing them as a shrub, basically, pruning them hard in the summer and winter to control their vigor. Because we don't want 35-foot mulberry trees. In fact, my original planting of mulberries was a couple of Illinois everbearing mulberries back in the early 1980s. And they quickly shot up to 25, 30 feet or something like that. And so now to harvest those fruits, we put clean sheets underneath them twice a week during the summer, and we just shake the branches, and then all the ripe berries will pour down onto the sheet, and we can gather it up and freeze them, and then we make them into that fruit we make into a mulberry jam, which has been a real popular jam over the years. And And also lately we've been doing mulberry wines, and that's also been real popular. And now there's also white fruited mulberries. One of them I found years ago growing along the banks of the Yakima River outside of Richland, and it was a white mulberry. And so it's when it first gets ripe and sweet, it's as white as a piece of paper, and then it turns to a light shade of lavender. And if you let it hang on the tree, it can actually dry into a raisin-like fruit, or you can just pick them and dry them on a sheet. And in some parts of the world, dried mulberries are used as a sweetener. They're so sweet, they're sweet as candy, really. And so it's an easy fruit to grow. Mulberry trees are either male or female, but the interesting thing is that the grafted female mulberries that we grow as grafted trees or as cutting grown trees are all selected female varieties that do not require a male tree in order to make fruit. So in fact, a lot of people have pollen allergies to the male pollen of mulberries. So we don't even have male mulberry trees around. They're not necessary for fruit production. It doesn't give them any advantages, except that they would produce viable seeds. So at any rate, so if you were to grow mulberries from seed or get a seedling mulberry tree, the odds are 50-50 that it'll be male or female. So at any rate, another fruit that's been very successful, one of our most successful commercial fruits is the kiwi fruit. And we grow 3 different species of kiwi commercially. The fuzzy kiwi is the one you're most familiar with from the stores. And so this is a fruit that we harvested back. We always let our kiwi fruits, our fuzzy kiwis, grow as long as possible into the fall before really hard freezes threaten to wipe them out. So they can take a light freeze. But I find that the longer I can let them go in the vineyard until we harvest them, the longer they're going to keep. And if we can hold off into November, early November, to harvest them, that we can generally hold some of the fruit into the summertime. So once again, like with the Asian pear, I was able to keep some of the fuzzy kiwi fruits for my own use last summer into August, when we had the Arctic Beauty kiwis coming on, so that I could claim that I'm eating my own fresh kiwi fruits 12 months out of the year. So the fuzzy kiwi fruits have no insect or disease problems that we've ever encountered. They can be immensely productive, typically 100 pounds a year, but up to 450 pounds a year on a single vine, if it's allowed to spread wide enough. These are very vigorous vines. They grow 10 feet or more a year. The vines are male and female. We usually have about 1 male for every 12 or 15 females. And incidentally, the fuzzy male can also cross-pollinate with what we call the hardy kiwis as well. They bloom around the same time and they're pollen compatible with each other. So the hardy kiwis, which we market as kiwi berries, are a smaller smooth skin fruit. And that's the fruit that we use to make this kiwi jam here, and also the kiwi wine that we make and sell now down at the farmers market. And it's been very popular. And the hardy kiwis are Actinidia deliciosa, that we market as a fresh fruit as kiwi berries. Those produce a fruit that's ripe in September, more or less, sometimes early October. Most of them are green skinned. All of them are smooth skinned. One variety is red skinned or purple skinned. It's called Ken's Red. And even the flesh is reddish. And a lot of the varieties of those varieties produce their fruit in clusters. So we can snip off a cluster just like harvesting a cluster of grapes. One of the things that we love about them, unlike with grapes, and now I have a grape vineyard, don't get me wrong, and I love grapes, but grapes have several problems for me. One is that because of our high elevation site here, they just barely ripen for us. And we've searched the world for the earliest ripening varieties of grapes, and they often will just barely ripen before the onset of fall rains that tend to make them split and get moldy and not get as sweet as we would like some years. Whereas with these hardy kiwi berries, they have ripened a crop for like 35 years in a row. They have never failed to ripen a crop for us. And the other thing is with our grape vineyard is that, we might have a crop of 300 grapevines loaded with fruit one day, ripening, getting very close to harvest. And later that day, we might have 1,000 birds, migrating birds, drop in the vineyard and clean us out if we don't watch it closely. And or go to the trouble of netting the vineyard. With the kiwi berries, that is not an issue, because with the kiwi berries, we harvest the berries before they get soft. And so basically they're inedible when we harvest them. They're inedible. And the same goes for the fuzzy kiwis. Now the fuzzy kiwis never ripen on the vine. You have to wait, you have to harvest them as late as possible, and then they go through an after ripening process at room temperature, quickly or very slowly in refrigerated storage. And that's how we can keep them for half a year. But with the hardy kiwi berries, we use a refractometer to test for ripening. But what I've found is that if you are a home grower with kiwi berries and you want to know when to harvest your crop, start checking them in September. And if you can find one soft one in 100, that's your clue to harvest the entire crop. And just strip the entire crop and they will get sweet. So just look for a soft one. If you can find a single soft one, if you wait till they're all soft, then they're not going to keep very well. And they're going to be kind of squishy as you harvest them. Whereas they're much easier to harvest when they're still kind of firm, and they'll keep for a few months if you harvest them while they're still firm. And because of this, we don't have any problems with the birds taking the crop or anything. We've never had any disease problems with the kiwi fruits, and we don't have any insect problems getting into the fruits or anything like that. So they've been a very rewarding, a very satisfying crop. We've also got incredible yields off them. 100 pounds is pretty typical on a mature vine, but just like with the fuzzy kiwis, we've gotten yields in excess of 300 or 400 pounds on an individual vine if it's allowed to spread over a wide enough area. They grow 10 feet a year, so they can take over a large area if you give it to them. Incidentally, the hardy kiwis or kiwi berries are also somewhat shade tolerant. That kiwi vine that I mentioned growing 80 to 100 feet up a hemlock tree is on the north side of the hemlock tree, and they're just as ripe as the ones that are growing in full sun, even though it's in a fairly shady situation there. And we also grow a species of kiwi known as Arctic Beauty kiwi, which is another smooth-skinned kiwi. What distinguishes the Arctic Beauty kiwi is that it ripens even earlier than the kiwi berries, and also the leaves have very interesting variegated foliage. So the leaves look like they've been dipped in white paint or pink paint. And so they just have interesting color variations on the leaves. They're smooth-skinned and also very sweet and ripe, the earliest of all the 3 species of kiwi. But they do bloom earlier than the other 2 species. So their bloom is not concurrent with the other 2 species. So they need their own male and female plant in order to make ripe fruits. At any rate, another fruit that we've been very successful with is the gummy fruit. And now gummy is in the Elaeagniaceae family. So it's in the family of nitrogen-fixing shrubs that produce edible berries. So Russian olive, autumn olive, gummy, and silverberry are all in this family of nitrogen-fixing shrubs. I first found out about autumn olives which is incidentally not related to true olives at all, and is called autumn olive only because the leaves look somewhat like an olive leaf. But they're much hardier than olives, much easier to grow. In fact, autumn olives are a berry a red berry that's ripe in September on a shrub that is quite shade tolerant. And because it's a nitrogen fixing shrub, I first saw a photograph of them in a book on growing nut trees, where they were using autumn olives shrubs as interplants between walnut trees, because the autumn olives were such good nitrogen fixers and were able to enhance the growth of the walnut trees, which are heavy nitrogen users. So they had a very nice symbiotic relationship. So we grew the autumn olives between our walnuts, and then later tried some of these other members of the Elaeagniaceae family. The gumi is the one that we like the most, although we do make an autumn olive fruit spread now. And the amazing thing about autumn olives and gumis is that these fruits they're not super sweet fruits. They're a little tangy, but they have the amazing property of having the highest levels of lycopenes of any fruit that's ever been found. Tomatoes are typically considered high lycopene fruits that are good at suppressing the growth of free radicals in the body that can lead to cancers and such. Well, these are 17 times as high as tomatoes in that respect. And they fruit for us every year. The autumn olive fruits are ripe in September. The gumi fruits are ripe in July. And both can grow in sun or shade. And they are self-pollinating, and they are very dependable fruits. And it's nice to have nitrogen fixing plants that enhance the growth of other plants around them. Also, the fibrous seeds, seed coating, I should say, inside the fruit is a source of fiber, can be eaten. It's definitely quite fibrous, but it can be eaten. And inside the seed itself is very high in beneficial fats and proteins. And I've even heard of people where autumn olives are considered a invasive plant back east, cutting down the plants and feeding them to their livestock, only to have them sprout back again. And so they basically use it as a perennial livestock food. And the foliage is comparable to that of alfalfa. So, a rich source of protein. So I think they're underappreciated fruits, really, that are very easy to grow. I have not found them to be particularly invasive in Washington State at all, the way they have been in certain areas back on the East Coast, probably because they planted millions and millions of them on the East Coast in the 1930s with the Civilian Conservation Service on mine reclamation sites and such. So they've naturalized back east. In the nut tree realm, we've grown all the different kinds of nut trees that can grow well here in Western Washington: walnuts, hazelnuts, and also minor nuts, black walnuts, butternuts, hickory nuts. I tried growing pecans, but not enough heat here, so I took the pecan orchard out. But the hickories do tend to ripen for us, and they taste kind of like I like them better than pecans, actually, although they have a much thicker shell. And they take forever to reach maturity, but now that they have reached maturity, I get a nice crop every year, and delicious nuts. The nut that we've been most successful with by far, though, is the chestnut. One of the reasons is that our farm is still surrounded by forest, which is an extensive forest that goes essentially all the way south to the Columbia River and north to the Arctic Circle. So squirrels can jump from one forest tree to the next to right into our nut orchards. But the nice thing about chestnuts is that they come packaged in a prickly husk, the size of a baseball or a softball, that no creature can get at until they're dead ripe. And that husk is as prickly as a porcupine backside. And so the nuts are perfectly protected until they're dead ripe. And then we go out and harvest them promptly. And some varieties of chestnuts will stick in the husk and others will release from the husk. But, you know, we grow many different kinds of chestnuts. Typically, these are the commercial varieties that, where's that? There we go. Oh, sorry, that we grow, and they have nice big nuts. And then this is an example of an American chestnut, which also grows here, but is a much smaller nut. But chestnuts bloom in the summertime, so they produce a nice crop every year. Now that we've identified chestnut varieties that work well in Western Washington, I started growing Chinese chestnuts back in the 1980s, and they were not well adapted for our climate here at all. And I didn't get any success with them to speak of. But when I started poking around on old homesteads and finding successful trees on old homesteads and finding trees in high alpine regions in Korea and in Italy and in the alpine regions of Italy and France, we started to find chestnut varieties that would work really well here. And so since we've introduced those varieties into cultivation in North America, we've been quite successful. And so now chestnuts are one of the crops that we wholesale off our farm, along with the kiwi berries and blueberries and a few other crops that we grow commercially. They're very versatile nuts. Our neighbor has written a chestnut cookbook. I had some for lunch today. I haven't lunch most afternoons. And I use them a lot in cooking as well. It's a very versatile nut, and so initially it's like a carbohydrate that grows on a tree. So very versatile. Other nuts that we grow, the heart nuts are worth mentioning. The heart nuts are a type of walnut that's shaped like a Valentine's heart. So it's actually a Japanese walnut. And the thing I like about heart nuts is that, well, they're a mild flavor. They're very very flavorful, relatively easy to crack with the right nut cracker, and they are very well adapted to our climate. They don't. That is to say, they are resistant to bacterial blight, which is an issue in Western Washington, and husk maggot, which is an issue in Western Washington for growing English type walnuts or Persian walnuts. And they're more widely adapted in terms of less deep soils. The English walnuts and black walnuts do great on really deep, fertile alluvial soils where the tap roots can develop properly. But heart nuts aren't as fussy in that regard. They'll grow on shallower soils, less well adapted and such. I think I've rambled on longer than I should have here. Other fruit trees that we grow successfully, I like to grow plums because we can grow better tasting plums than you can buy in any grocery store, because like figs, they don't ship well. So you know, if I think I'd like to stop now so I can allow for any questions that there might have.
Well, thank you. Wow. A lot of information packed into that short period of time. I'd be happy for you to ramble on for hours, but I guess we do have a time crunch here. Any questions?
I had one question, Michael.
Yeah.
How do you spell gummy berries?
Goumi. And I don't know if you can see that. And it's the Latin name is Elaeagnus multiflora.
Great, thank you.
Here's some good books. This is the elderberry book. There's a good reference book.
What's wrong with my fruit garden?
Yeah.
Neat.
Have you ever grown any honeyberries?
Oh yeah, we grow honeyberries, sure. They're pretty well adapted here. They can grow in part shade. They're fairly shade tolerant. Their early ripening, I'd say that that's their biggest virtue, is that they're early ripening. So they're ripe before blueberries. They're a blueberry-like fruit. I mean, they're not related to blueberries, but they're blue-colored fruit. They're more elongated than blueberries, and ripen earlier. You know, they're from really cold regions, so some varieties will tend to bloom a little early and can be susceptible to late frosts, but no, they're definitely something that can be grown here. There's some interest in growing them commercially now. And I noticed that they're grown commercially in Alaska now, and in Canada, and really cold areas.
Are those Lonicera?
Yes. Yep. Also known as yasberries or yesberries. Yeah, they have other names too. But a shrub form of honeysuckle. So yeah, there's a lot of good fruits out there. Currants and gooseberries do great here. They're very well adapted to this climate. Aronia berries do great here. Aronia berries are one of those tart berries that are very, very tart. Another name for them is chokeberry. When they first turn black, they're very astringent, but you let them hang on about a month and they lose their astringency. And they're incredibly nutritious, very easy to grow, great fall color.
There's some questions in the chat. One is, are there any of the hybrid plum apricots that do well here?
Well, there's some great tasting ones, that's for sure, that came out of Zager Genetics in California. But this is, quite a different climate, and they've been they're not as successful for us as plums are, as Japanese plums or European plum varieties. But I have gotten them to ripen here. That's not an issue. Now, some of the varieties are on the late side of ripening, and so Flavor Supremes, though, and Flavor Grenades have both ripened well for us and are great tasting hybrids that have. But I just don't get the consistent yields, and also I seem to notice more disease issues with them than we have with the good quality Japanese and European plums varieties that are more locally adapted, like Italians and Shiro plums or beauty plums or Methley plums, that sort of thing. But I'm a colder area too, so probably be more successful in a drier area. We get twice the precipitation of Seattle, so so we have more disease pressure.
Talking about the cold, were your fuzzy kiwis around when you had that bout of very cold weather around 0 degrees?
Yes.
How did they do?
Yeah, they survived. Yeah, they survived. We sell two varieties of fuzzy kiwi, two female varieties, that is to say, and one male variety. And one is the Hayward, and the other is Saanich. And I guess in colder areas, the Saanich variety, which is originally from the Saanich Research Station on Vancouver Island in British Columbia, that one proved to be a little hardier than Hayward by a few degrees. But they both survived at our place, at 0. I don't think they're hardy to much below that though. So the fuzzies, and there may have been some dieback on them, but the vines themselves did survive. Yeah. Not nearly as cold as it used to be.
Right.
That's for sure. That's for sure.
Yeah.
U.S. Grant, when he was stationed at Fort Vancouver in the 1850s, rode his horse across the frozen Columbia River to Oregon.
Wow.
Can you imagine how cold that must have been?
Oh, yeah. There you go.
Okay. More questions?
Yeah, I can keep going with the questions in the chat. Unless anybody else who would like to unmute, just feel free to pop in. So how tall do the European elderberries get?
Well, I have seen them over 20 feet in Ireland, but we don't let them get that big. We just prune them. So, and I'm sure it varies, you know, from site to site and age of plant and you know, varietal characteristics, I'm sure vary as well. But most people don't want to get them that big because they would be hard to harvest. But on the other hand, some commercial elderberry growers actually will cut their bushes down to the ground, and then they'll sprout back up and make fruit again. So they're pretty amazing fruits.
About gooseberries, Mike, someone said you mentioned at one time that you grow most of them in shade. Is that still the case? And do they produce okay in that environment?
Yeah, we used to grow our gooseberries in the hickory nut orchard and in the pecan nut orchard. And so they did continue to produce in the shade. Although I will say this, that hickories and pecans are late to leaf out in the spring. They are not one of our earliest trees to leaf out. They're one of our later trees to leaf out. So by the time they had leafed out and made shade, the gooseberries and currants had already bloomed. But you know, by the time the fruits were ripe, they were in pretty shady conditions, and they were pretty much as, yes, I would say they were just as sweet. They were just as sweet as the ones growing in full sun. So gooseberries and currants, I would say, have a limited life, more so than say blueberries. I've seen blueberry plants that were 70 years old that were still quite productive, as long as they're pruned over the years to renew them. They maintain good production. But and it may be the case with currants and gooseberries too. We kind of took a lot of that patch out when we took out the pecans and hickories. No, I didn't take out the hickory, just the pecans. So yeah.
Yeah, I had a question about that actually. Was that because they weren't getting a long enough growing season?
Right, exactly. We pecans, even the northernmost pecans, which is the types that I was growing, were from the northern part of their range, which is like Rock Island, Illinois, and Green River, Iowa. Well, those areas, even though they're pretty far north and they get real cold in the winter, they get hot summers with hot nights. We don't have hot nights in Western Washington, not at all. So that makes a big difference. You know, we would go on to family reunions in Wisconsin, and in the summer, and their corn would be waist high and mine would be ankle high because of the hot nights and the hot days.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Are there varieties or species that you anticipate we might be able to grow in 50 or 100 years because of climate change?
Of pecans?
Pecans or anything else?
Oh, yeah. Well, yeah, I mean,
It's maybe a very broad question.
yeah. I don't know about pecans. I think that, you know, while climate change is a reality, and our growing season is getting longer, we have a very strong Pacific influence in Western Washington. So that, you know, the world's largest body of water is such a huge influence, a huge tempering influence on our climate, that I think that here in Western Washington, we're going to be less affected by most of the rest of the world in terms of, you know, dramatic climate change.
Yeah, interesting.
Yeah. So I don't see ripening pecans, except maybe with some of the hybrids with hickories, and you know, some of these northern pecans are pretty tiny nuts too. This is a shagbark hickory and this is a shellbark hickory, and shagbark hickories are the northern of the hickory family. They go up into Ontario and Quebec in Canada, and up into Wisconsin. The shellbarks, and these are upland trees. The shellbarks are more bottomland trees, and they don't go quite. They go as far north as Illinois, but we have no problem ripening the shagbarks, and the shellbarks ripen only in a good year, but at our location. But they both of them are in the same genus as pecans, and so there are crosses between the two, and they're called hicons, and so that would be the best avenue for getting something ripe. But the northern pecan, the northern pecans are not very big nuts. They're about this size, so they're not like a southern pecan, And shagbarks have just as good a flavor, I think, as the
Okay, yeah, cool.
Yeah. Thicker shell, but takes a special nutcracker.
Someone asked about bush cherries that were developed by Meter. Are they worthwhile growing here?
Well, Meter was from New Hampshire, and so he needed hardiness, and so he got those. He got the genetic material from for those from Korea, where he lived for a while, and they're more akin to a tart cherry than a sweet cherry. There's been a lot of interesting work done with tart cherries by the Canadians, and they've developed excellent tart cherries that are easy to propagate, and so they can be grown as from cuttings on their own roots. So they can be grown as a bush, which means they're very easy to protect, and they're hardy and they're good tasting, and a lot of them are flavorful enough and sweet enough to eat raw, and such. And I've had better luck with those than I've had with Meters varieties, but I think they can be grown too. But we grow great sweet cherries at our farm. Gosh, we had some for dessert last night. We freeze them because we get so many that we can't eat them all, so we freeze them for a year-round supply, and I like them frozen. They're great snacking. So the main thing is with cherries is that you just have to keep them short so you can net them. Otherwise, you're just growing them for the birds. So
yeah.
But I also want to mention that that I've found very good results with tart cherries and joint pain. So I make it a habit of consuming tart cherries every day in some form or another, dried or juice or as frozen berries, because it's really helpful for my joint issues. And I find that if I go without it for a while, I notice the difference.
Write that one down.
Yeah.
What do you think? How have you had any luck growing pawpaws?
Yes, I have. Here's a book on growing pawpaws, and I've grown pawpaws for probably close to 30 years or so, 25 or 30 years. They're kind of slow to start fruiting. I didn't include it in my talk because it's not the easiest fruit to grow. But this time of the year, I start thinking about pawpaws because I grow tens of thousands of nut trees every year in the nursery. And so when we start nut seeds in beds, I have to protect them from mice. Otherwise, they'll dig them up and eat them. And so I'm trapping mice. And I put screens over the beds when they're just sprouting, but once they sprout, I have to take the screens off, and the mice sometimes pull them up and eat them. So I trap mice, and when I trap mice this time of the year, I put their carcasses out in the pawpaw patch, because pawpaws are not pollinated by traditional pollinating bees and bumblebees. Only carrion flies will pollinate pawpaws. So I need a source of carrion. So I throw the mice out into the pawpaw patch, and that's and before I did that, I wasn't getting any pawpaws, and now I get pawpaws every year. So it's either that or hand pollinate them, and pawpaws are slow to get growing, and they start out as really tiny trees because they don't transplant well as large fruit trees. So you want to start them out as a small potted plant, and they but they're kind of cool looking, and they don't have any insect or disease problems. In fact, they found that the pawpaw foliage can be made into a potent botanical insecticide. So insects aren't bothered by them. But one problem that we have in the nursery is that slugs love pawpaw leaves. So when they're tiny in the nursery, that can be a real problem. But as established trees in the orchard, they're real easy to grow once they get established. I would say the biggest issue with them is that they are, for me, late ripening. And so it's one of the last fruits that I harvest because they just don't ripen for me until October, till late October. And so by then they're starting to lose their leaves, and we don't have very good weather generally in October, late October and early November when we're harvesting them. So they just barely ripen for me at this elevation. They would be more successful at a lower elevation, but they do ripen most years. I would say I probably get ripe pawpaws 9 years out of 10. So, yeah, and they have very large leaves. They're kind of tropical looking, and most of the family is tropical, in fact. But they're related to cherimoyas, from Central America. They taste good. They're good. They're good eating fruits. The skin isn't edible, but the soft flesh when it's ripe is good. They have big seeds that are the size of lima beans inside of them. So you kind of eat around those. They definitely will grow here. They talk about, in the literature, they talk about it being a very shade tolerant, in fact, needing shade when they're young. That's not the case in Western Washington. Give them a good sunny spot in Western Washington. So if you're gonna try them.
Okay.
Yeah.
We had a question about pear rust. Is that something you deal with? It's been a major problem on Bainbridge Island, and they're trying copper spray.
Yeah. Is that, yeah, I mean, it's mostly I guess a cosmetic. I mean, there's pear blister mites on the leaves, or are we talking about the skabbiness on the fruit?
This is Darren from Bainbridge Island, but yeah, it's actually the red spots that appear on the leaves, and then underneath the leaves will grow like this alien creature with all these tentacles that come out the back of the leaf, and it's causing entire pear trees to die here on the island.
Wow.
After several years, yeah, I hear people say, "Oh, it's just cosmetic, just a few spotted leaves." No, it's literally killing entire trees.
Wow.
And to the point where it's causing canker. It's like a worst case of anthracnose on steroids.
Wow.
And it's causing a lot of dead branch dieback, fruit being damaged with big holes in it. It's just horrible. And it just came on the island about maybe 2 or 3 years ago, and it's spreading like crazy. And it's caused by the junipers, who are kind of the host for the spores that then transfer onto the pear trees. Mm-hmm. And so I don't know if you had any experience with it. I mean, if you have neighbors, I'm happy to say
I've never heard of it even. Yeah.
Oh, it's spreading like crazy, and people are cutting down their whole pear orchards because it's not worth it.
Yeah, that sounds awful.
Darren, how have you determined that it is pear rust?
It's pretty prevalent. I mean, I've Googled it. It's if you Google pear rust and you look on it, it's basically these large orange spots that appear on the outer leaves. They come on around May, and then they grow larger and larger throughout the summer. And then the back of the leaf, you'll see these kind of tentacles spreading out from underneath the leaf. Mm-hmm. And those are the ones that then spread to the junipers. The junipers then host the spore over the winter. and then spread it back to the pear trees in the spring. And what I've read is that you have to do some sort of a fungicide on the leaves starting in April. Every 7 days you have to spray, and then at the end of May you can stop. So you're talking about a lot of spraying, about 8 weeks. And so this is the first year I'm trying the spray, so we'll see.
Yeah.
I'm hoping I get a pear someday. This is traumatic to me because I have a lot of pears and a lot of varieties, and some Asian pears are a little bit more resistant to it. Like the Korean giant you mentioned, it seems to be resistant to it somewhat. But the European pears are all pretty much decimated.
Wow, that's awful.
I have a similar problem, Darren, and I read that quinces also are susceptible and will host. So I'd like to talk to you more about that.
Yeah, well, it's a big experiment this year, see if I succeed. I've cut down most of my pears so that they're within not giant trees anymore, just so I can get to the spraying part, because I don't want to be spraying like, 20-foot trees.
Yeah.
But it's a journey right now.
Yeah.
Good luck.
Yeah, thank you.
Someone mentioned in the chat about removing the junipers, which are the alternate host.
Yeah.
I've offered my neighbor $5,000 to get rid of them, and she won't.
Oh, geez.
So, and if you live in a kind of suburban area, there's junipers everywhere. I mean, there's just, it's one of these landscape plants that people grow, and so it's very hard to get rid of them.
Yeah.
I mean, I've thought about going over there and say I'm putting fertilizer, but it's really Roundup, but I'm not going to do that.
Yeah, understand.
I'm going to keep going through the chat questions. So someone mentioned on a Facebook video that you gave on grafting, you suggested a plum rootstock called Mariana 26-24. And do you offer this? And would you graft their old Italian plum cuttings because they're not that good at grafting?
Well, yeah, absolutely. That would work as a rootstock for Italian plum, sure. Yeah, and it's pretty. Practice makes perfect with grafting. If you have a good sharp knife, practice on some branches until you get the technique down. And
I know personally I'm a musician, so I'm a little bit worried about accidentally cutting a finger off. But
yeah. Well, that's why we made the video, to make it to illustrate the simplest technique I know of for grafting. And the one thing that I give as advice there is to just never point the blade at yourself. And using a simple whip graft, you never have to point it towards you. So never have to point it towards you. And it's simple, and it's very quick, and heals rapidly. And so yeah, give it a shot.
Someday.
Yeah. We do a custom grafting occasionally with people bring us the material. So
okay, well, it's good to know. Someone asked if there's a pomegranate that works here.
Well, the problem with them is that that's one of those crops that, like the pecans, that we grow for the nursery, because we are a mail order nursery business for people in warmer climates. I would say there are two problems with pomegranates. One would be the winter hardiness, and the other would be the lack of heat. Like pecans, to ripen the fruit properly. So no, I don't think there's any varieties that taste any good that would ripen in a Western Washington climate. They might survive the winter. They are hardier as they get more established, and there are many mild places in Western Washington that could probably grow them successfully, especially if they were given protection the first winter, because generally by the second winter they're considerably hardier. But there's not enough heat to ripen them in Western Washington. Not nearly enough.
Okay, someone said they bought some kiwis from you that were pretty well rooted, about 3 feet tall, one hardy kiwi male and 2 females. one hardy, and one fuzzy female. They get good leaves but no flowers. What could be the cause of that?
Also mention how old they are.
How old are they?
Well,
they-
it's me, so I'm going to chime in if this, I cannot remember. I mean, I think they're about, when I bought them, I'm not sure how they were old from you, but I think they're about 3 to 4 years old now.
Well, that's within the range of the length of time that it takes for some varieties to come to reach maturity and start flowering and fruiting. So I would say that, I mean, there are some varieties that flower and fruit very quickly, but those varieties have defects generally that, so they're not necessarily the best ones to grow. Their only real virtue is that they flowered faster. Most of the varieties, you know, it would take 3, 4, 5, 6 years to reach maturity, and a lot of it just depends on how they're grown and how they're pruned, but mostly it just takes some time to get established. The only other issue would be if you were an area that was subject to late frost. If they flushed out, one year we had a very unusually late frost. We at our location, we generally will get frosts into May, into the first or second week of May. That's normal for us. But the kiwi berries aren't very far along by then, and the frosts are light enough that it doesn't seem to bother them. Well, one year, the kiwi vines had put out a considerable growth already, and so they were no longer as hardy. And then we had a really hard frost that year, and so it blackened all of that new growth on the kiwi vines. But if you look at a kiwi vine right now, not all the buds have started. Some of the buds are still dormant, whereas others are swollen and starting to show green. And so that was the way that the kiwi vines are able to deal with a real late frost, is that they can come out with a second set of leaves, and the crop will be reduced then, but they are still capable of making one. But if you are in an area where they are subject to a late frost, a very late frost that burned back the initial growth, that would have an impact on their ability to flower and fruit for that year. So to some extent, but I would just be patient. If they're 3 or 4 years old, for example, they're probably going to start flowering and fruiting this year, or certainly by next year.
Okay, yeah, well, that's encouraging. They're really, one female is doing a great job. The one that's not doing, grows kind of slowly, is the hardy male.
Oh,
She's so I don't know, you know, but they definitely are live still.
Yep, good.
So, okay, thanks a lot.
Yeah, and they are responsive to water and fertilizer. They're definitely very responsive to water and fertilizer.
Any particular fertilizer?
Well, you know, I mean, I give them composted chicken manure once a year in the spring. So
okay, I can
any
do that.
any balanced fertilizer.
Okay, so seriously, just you know, the combined chicken manure that, you know, in the sawdust, and just throw it on.
Oh yeah, absolutely, absolutely.
Okay, I should then ask Darren, what particular chickens love slugs? Any particular chicken breeds that love slugs?
All chickens.
All chickens. Okay, because I have some, but I haven't really determined.
And ducks love slugs.
Okay.
Well,
okay.
I mean, I've had chickens before, and when the chicks are little, they tend to play with the little slugs and they eat them. But then they get to a certain point where they're too gooey and the chickens won't eat the slugs. But this latest batch of chickens have a couple Morans, a couple of Dominiques, Americana, and Rhode Island Red, and they fight over them. And it doesn't matter what size, they're like fighting over these big giant slugs, and I'm just saying yes. So I'm throwing slugs at them and they're eating them like crazy. So I'm saying, I don't know, these are weird chickens.
Okay, that's great. Different varieties.
You know how some people rent out their goats, you know, to go take care of brush on people's
Right.
property. maybe you could rent out your chickens.
Yeah.
Come on to my house.
That would maybe pay for my pear rest
Yeah.
peer effort.
Yeah. I have a question. Micah, you were talking earlier about a white mulberry.
Yeah.
What do you sell more than one variety of white mulberry?
Yeah, we usually sell several varieties. Yeah, the sweet lavender is the one I found in Eastern Washington, and we have white ivory is another variety that we sell.
Okay. I'll have to check what I ordered from you.
Mhm. Yeah,
Okay, thanks.
yeah.
Other-
Someone asked if you're giving tours at the moment, or if you're not because of COVID, when are you planning to start them up again? If you
Yeah,
have-
with COVID, we've tried to protect our workers and everything, and so we're only operating pickups at our gate. So our retail outlet now is just the Olympia Farmers Market. I'm there on Saturdays. I have an employee there on Friday and Sunday. A couple of years ago, we were doing tours in the summer. We had to cancel them last summer, obviously. I don't know about this next summer. If you have them or not. Just see how things go, I guess.
Yeah, definitely.
Great. Anybody else with questions? Hearing none. Well, Michael, I just want to thank you. Thank you so very much.
Thank you very much.
Great
you.
information.
Great.
Uh,
Thank you. My
yeah.
pleasure.
And you have your website. It's
Yep.
burntridgenursery.com.
Yep. Mhm. Yep.
Sounds like it could be that.
Yep. Yep.
All right. Well, anyone else have any questions about things? We probably about time to wrap up here. Folks are saying thanks and super interesting and
All right.
yeah.
Great.